I'm Sarah Kelsey, board member and head of the program committee of the Irvington Historical Society. We are pleased to present the perfect topic and speaker in honor of Women's History Month. Margaret Hardenbroek was the foremost trader of the new Dutch colony in present-day New York. She and her fellow merchants were not only brave, strong, and wealthy, but also passed the torch of female empowerment to other women who came after them. This talk will explore the life of Hardenbroek, the most famous she merchant, and some of those who followed her and became devout church builders, savvy political wives, innovative architects, staunch suffragists, well-known philanthropists, and brilliant entrepreneurs. Jean Zimmerman, our speaker today, has published numerous works of fiction and nonfiction, including The Women of the House, How a Colonial She Merchant Built a Mansion, a Fortune, and a Dynasty. She lives in Hastings-on-Hudson and is currently writing a memoir of her experiences in the world of trees. I will now turn it over to Jean.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Okay, so welcome everybody. And I'm so happy that you're all here with me to celebrate Women's History Month. Now, I happen to believe that Women's History Month should be every month, but I'm sure you agree with me. Anyway, so today I'm going to be sharing with you the story of a figure in our history called the She Merchant. Now, um, Sarah told you a little bit about her already, so I'll kind of skip that introduction and tell you about when I first discovered that term. I was researching the women of the house, and when I first heard it, I found it was so mysterious, so almost thrilling to hear that, and I had no idea what it meant. So I went down some rabbit holes, and it turned out that Margaret Hardenbrook was the greatest she merchant of them all. And so I found out a bit more about her, and I found that Margaret came to this tiny Dutch outpost on Manhattan called New Amsterdam in 1659. She was only 22 years old. And when she came here, she wasn't the only she merchant. There would have been lots and lots more. So this map shows us what the city, what the seaport looked like when Margaret first arrived. It shows every street, every farm, every garden, pasture, warehouse, etc. And so this is actually where she would have walked around when she arrived. So the seaport was a promising marketplace, and it was controlled by a group of rich men in Holland who persuaded the Dutch government to let them trade in what was then called the Netherland, which was Manhattan Island all the way up to Hudson to Albany. So women like Margaret were an important part of that. When she stepped off the boat in 1659, she was on a mission. She worked for her cousin, who was a successful trader, and she was something called a factor, Factor. That meant she walked around the streets that I just showed you to collect money on his behalf and to market his merchandise to buyers. So that meant things like cooking oil and straight pins, which it's hard to imagine now, but were so important in a time before zippers. So the word that was used to describe Margaret and her fellow she merchants was simple, she merchant. And she merchants on Manhattan included tavern owners, fish sellers, laundresses, midwives. And there were a lot of she merchants on Manhattan. If you think about it, out of a total population of about 1,000, a census found that there were actually 134 female traders in the 1950s when Margaret arrived. So that's a lot, 134 out of 1,000. So they helped give the town its mercantile muscle. Now, I want you to take a look at this engraving, and we will come back to it during this presentation. It's really important. It's from the 1650s, about when Margaret arrived, and it shows a man and a woman engaged in some kind of trade. So it's realistic in the sense that you can look behind them and you can see all kinds of structures that would have existed then, gabled rooftops, Dutch flag, gallows, courthouse, and you can see ships in the harbor. So this is a faithful reproduction of what was in there. So we don't have a photograph of Margaret, unfortunately, but she did arrive in 1659. So I think we can imagine that this might well be her portrait. So let's imagine that together. This is Margaret. So what do we see here? Well, it's some kind of heated exchange, I would say. The male trader holds a tobacco leaf. The female trader holds a basket of something like produce, probably. And when you take a closer look, you can see something odd at their feet. This is a beaver. It's all rolled up and it's ready to go to market. You can see the paw, you can see the head. So this is also somewhat realistic. I want you to pay a little closer attention though, and look at their body language. He seems agitated, really wanting to make this transaction. He holds out his hand like, let's do this thing now. Now, what about her? You can see her curly hair, her ruffled dress, her gauzy collar, her lace bodice, even her shoes are decorative. Um, they look like they might be high heels, who knows? And she's wearing a hat just like his, although it has a bit more decoration. Well, look though, she's partly turned away from him. So let's look a little closer even. Okay, so here's a close-up of Margaret. I want you to look at her forearms holding that basket. They look almost a little buff, muscular, right? And then consider her facial expression. This is important. So she looks a little bit skeptical. She doesn't look unpleasant, but she's not necessarily ready to comply. She takes no guff. She's powerful in a way that doesn't need to make a big thing about it. She's saying, just give me a better deal, okay? When you're ready. So I asked a 30-year-old friend how she would interpret this engraving, and particularly the portrait of Margaret. And her response was uncomplicated. She's a badass. So I want to follow my friend's lead and talk about this badass shoe merchant and her badass descendants. But because I know that badass is not a proper term for use in a polite historical lecture, I'm going to come up with something else. So, how about this? Boss. Okay, that's her expression. Boss lady. Okay, so we're going to see a succession of boss ladies today. So a she merchant like Margaret did not just appear out of thin air. Holland equipped girls with the same fundamental uh, skills as boys: math, reading, writing, and it was the only country in Europe that did. I'm going to give you a quote from a letter of an Englishman to Holland. He said, women there are, quote, so well versed in bargaining, ciphering, and writing that in the absence of their husbands and long sea voyages, their words will pass in equal credit. So here is Margaret's signature on a court document. Dutch women struck English observers as unusual. Dutch women, wrote one person, are more, I love this quote, are more fond of and delighted with lasciviousness and obscene talk than either the English or the French. That was probably saying something then. Anyway, they ice skated through the night. They relieved themselves in public. They even went tavern hopping with their friends. Imagine. So, something maybe more important, the Dutch women had actually two options when it came to marriage. One was called manus, and that meant a woman had the status of a minor under the guardianship of her husband. She had no standing in court. She could not enter any contract without her husband's authority. She couldn't own any property. So Manus actually resembled English common law. A proper English family, you might be aware, was a kingdom with a godlike husband and a wife, children, and servants in declining status. There was another option, though, for the Dutch. It was something called usus. Under this alternative, a wife retained all the rights she'd had as a single person. This marriage was a partnership of equals. Also, inheritance was different. And when her husband died, a woman would receive half the property in the estate. So wealthy widows were common in Holland and in New Amsterdam. This is what the tiny port looked like at that time. Margaret was what was called a free merchant of New Amsterdam, and that's how she was described in a court document. So, what did she do? She married a trader with a small fleet of ships. When he died, and she didn't kill him, he died of natural causes. She expanded. She expanded the fleet that he left to her. And what do you think she did? She called the first ship that she built the Margaret. These were called flute ships. Flute ships. And this is what her fleet would have included. These look like they're bulging with merchandise. So Margaret married a fellow trader after that named Frederick Phillips. Together they expanded their fleet to around 2 dozen vessels. And it was extremely lucrative, bringing furs from the New World and different goods back to New Amsterdam. And this is an early proposal for New Amsterdam's coat of arms. It's a little bit funny, I think, but it's serious too, because the town was founded on the beaver trade, and beaver was at the heart of Margaret's business. I like this Dutch painting because linen was so important to Margaret's trade as well. And this shows the place in Holland where linen would be laid out in the sun to dry before a trader like Margaret would pack it into those food ships to bring it back here. Okay, England made New Netherland, New York in 1664. The rules changed for women. Now, Margaret was not legally allowed to trade under her own name, but she still did trade. So, shipping manifests of the time show the scope of her enterprise with Frederick Phillips. To give you an idea, Margaret imported hundreds upon hundreds at a time of iron hatchets, stockings, women's bodices, buttons, knives, combs, hooks and eyes, etc., frying pans, pipes, 30,000 goose quills at a time, if you can imagine. And then their ships going back to Holland were equally full. One ship alone carried thousands of beaver pelts, bear skins, fox, timber minks, otter, muskrat. And that's just one trip. It would be hard to overstate the importance of beaver at that time to Margaret. So people relied upon beaver to make hats. And that was so important. It's hard to imagine now. But the thing about beaver fur is it had these unique interlocking hairs that not only made a hat glossy, but also made it waterproof, which was so important in a time before widespread use of umbrellas. Fur had other uses, of course, as well, fashion. So by the time the couple bought 300 acres of prime Westchester land in 1670, Dutch rule had changed over to British. So what did it look like then? It's hard to imagine now, but I think that this landscape and river view from Undermire is probably pretty close. Phillips Manor Hall, okay. So Margaret and Frederick built their house in the forest in what is downtown Yonkers. It doubled as a secure warehouse for goods that they were transporting between New Amsterdam and Albany. The river was kind of a super highway of the time, and archaeologists have found green tiles in the basement that prove that this was a secure place to store merchandise at that time. Something else interesting about the house that Margaret built. So these are fireplace tiles, very different from the blue and white ones most Dutch people use. You can see that they portray something that the Dutch called wilden. So wilden. So people that hadn't been over to America had this crazy idea that there were cyclops here or unicorns, other wild beasts. So that's what they saw as the indigenous people here. Now, Margaret would have known better because she and Frederick traded themselves with the locals. This is the front door that Margaret installed, also for security, very heavy. Supposedly, it's of ebony that she imported from Africa. And this is something Margaret would have had in her house. It's called a cos, and it's a kind of linen cabinet. And linen, as I said, was so important to the Dutch. So you can see this one is painted with fertility symbols, fruits, and that kind of thing. And that was typical. So in 1674, Frederick was listed as the wealthiest man in New York, and we don't have a similar designation for Margaret, but it's pretty much acknowledged that she was the richest woman. Margaret and Frederick eventually acquired 57,000 acres. They built a house in Albany, and Margaret hired her father to handle her business in Albany. So there was a young missionary who traveled on one of Margaret's ships in 1679. And he had some things to say about Margaret in keeping with this boss lady idea. And this is from his journal. It shows the east side of the Hudson. Um, so Margaret, he said, was shrewd. She was stingy. She was miserly. And above all, she was arrogant. How horrible. Interestingly, on this voyage, she brought along one of her daughters, her 12-year-old daughter, for this lengthy 6-week trip abroad. And that wasn't uncommon for her. On the ship, she was more powerful than the captain. So Margaret died in 1691 at the age of 54. There's no record of her death, of how she died. It's as if she simply vanished, or maybe she got pushed overboard. We don't know. In any case, on to the next boss lady. So when Margaret died, the year after she died, Frederick married again, somebody named Catherine Van Cortlandt. She was 39. And I was saying that this picture probably conveys pretty well what Catherine would have looked like. By the way, what she's wearing on her face is something that was called a sun expelling mask, and it was meant to keep your complexion great during bad weather. Um, so Catherine had money from a previous marriage and also from her father, Olaf Van Cortlandt. So remember that laws regarding what women could and could not do had changed now that the British were in control. But Dutch tradition still held sway, as it would over time, we'll see. So Catherine was able to keep the money that she brought to the match and to control her personal fortune. Now, Margaret had built her house in Yonkers. Now Catherine built her own house, a house of worship. So this is the Dutch Reformed Church that she supervised the building of. And of course, it still exists today. On to the next. When Frederick died, he didn't leave Catherine much money. He did instruct that she should raise his grandson. So she took the grandson to England where he was educated, and then she brought him back. Um, and his inheritance, Frederick II, made him one of the richest people in the colony, and he became a politician. Okay, next up for the shoe merchant legacy. So this is Frederick's wife, Joanna Brockholz. She was the daughter of a British mayor of New York. And she married Frederick when she was 19. So Joanna would have received an education, but very different from the one that girls would have received in Holland. So girls in New York now, they learn dancing, embroidery, painting on glass, if you can imagine, while boys learned reading, writing, ciphering, navigation, that kind of thing. So this shows Joanna at middle age, and you can see she's wearing nice clothes and this silk bow at her on her bodice and stuff. So Joanna, of course, was not a ship owner. She wasn't a church builder. She wasn't even a person that could travel independently to Europe at some point. She did become the consummate political wife. So she expanded Philip's Manor Hall in the British manner, and this is a good example. She also spent time in New York City, which was increasingly cosmopolitan, also in the British mode. So we're lucky to have this amazing map that I love. And it was created by a Mrs. Buckner in 17, 1735. And on it, she indicates all the kinds of pleasure gardens and all this kind of thing that a woman visiting from out of town might want to go to. For one thing, there was something called a kissing bridge. There were actually numerous kissing bridges in New York at this time. Um, One vicar wrote it was, quote, part of the etiquette to salute the lady who has put herself under your protection. So we can imagine what that meant. So flirtation, fashion, it was actually said that the doorways of the manor hall had to be expanded to accommodate something called panniers. Now, panniers were metal frames that a woman would wear underneath her dress that would extend the dress to as much of a yard on either side. So there was so much luxury, fresh fish, wild strawberries, rum punch, gowns that women would commission from European dressmakers. At the same time, I found in my research that there was a randy, gamey quality about the area. People had these elegant table linens, yet they detested soap and water. Women commissioned fancy gowns, yet they wore no underdrawers. It just wasn't done. Men also dressed up. At home, a gentleman would wear another British import called a banyan, Banyan. And that was again British style. Another British import that maybe we should bring back was something called patches. Patches were black and silk dots that you would glue onto your face when you went to a party. For example, one at the Manor Hall. Okay, next. When Joanna's father died when Joanna's husband died in 1751, his firstborn son inherited four New York City townhouses, half a dozen acres of land, storehouses, slaves, a New Jersey salt meadow, and the other four children inherited property as well. So what about Joanna? We saw her picture. Um, they've been married for 32 years, okay? What did she get? Just a cash annuity. She got free use of their house in Manhattan, but not the full possession of it. But guess what? Frederick directed that she get firewood delivered to her house from her son. And so he ensured that she would be warm during the winter, but that's really about it. So Mary, who you see her here, was Joanna's daughter. This portrait of her is from when she was just out of her teens. And you can see her self-satisfaction here, her spunk. Um, but can you catch a hint of Mary's great grandmother, Margaret, and her expression? I know I can. So for Mary, as the revolution approached, there was no shortage of partners served up by the men who fought in the French and Indian War. Oh, that's Mary, her great grandmother. Okay, George. When he met Mary in 1756, he was already a war hero. So we can pretty much see what the man who wooed Mary would have looked like. This is who she married. Um, um, I can't describe him. I think you'll have to see for yourselves. But in any case, he was more British than George. And I think that is something that attracted Mary to him. So when they got married, Mary could not legally own land anymore. Still, the bulk of the couple's income derived from rents that on her portion of the 200,000 acre parcel of land that she had inherited. With it, the two built themselves a mansion in northern Manhattan. So Mary was known for her independence. She rode mile upon mile on horseback to collect her tenants' rents. She wasn't a she merchant. She wasn't a church builder. She wasn't a political wife, but she was a self-educated architect. So the mansion took over 3 years to complete. There were 19 rooms, 7 bedrooms, a newfangled octagonal drawing room, and the whole thing cost £3,500. Okay, it was a small fortune, but Mary could afford it. You can still visit that house, which is now called Morris Jumel. 1776. Mary had already sold most of the furniture out of their second home in Manhattan. And she packed the kids off to live with relatives. Now there was a giant fire that torched Manhattan. Mary and her children, they took shelter in Yonkers at Phillips Manor Home. And I'm sure she could see the flames from the Yonkers shoreline. At that time, or a little bit before, John Singleton Copley got very famous for this painting, A Boy with a Scroll. So Mary, who was ever fashionable, commissioned her own portrait. In it, you can see her as a kind of melancholy matron of 41, chic white satin, a trendy Turkish belt, but as I said, melancholy. Now, you have to remember that at that time, Roger had skedaddled off to England, claiming that he thought the family would be in trouble if he stayed. So he left Mary on her own. And she had every luxury still. But at the same time, um, Yonkers was probably a very scary place. So in 1779, the New York legislature signed into law something called the Act of Attainder and named all the traders in the area, including 3 women. And Mary was at the top of the list. So the whole family fled their beautiful estate, going to England. Um, and with that is where Mary would live out her life. You know, she had been strong to the end. She was shaped by that merchant boss lady tradition. Okay, now I am going to digress from Philip's family history and New York history. We're going to go back to a different period, actually, paleo history. Okay. I can't help but see our current generation of boss ladies through the lens of what went before. Yes, it's a far cry from New Amsterdam, but bear with me. Um, Strong women have prevailed forever. Okay, it's not a recent phenomenon. So these figurines, they're figurines, we found a lot of them, hundreds from Paleolithic times, all throughout Europe. And they celebrated, even worshiped women at that time. She was carved in Western Anatolia in 3000 BC. Or this one from Cyprus at around the same time. Or this one I really love from Mesopotamia, a beautiful and powerful. And there's even a certain similarity, I think, to a certain badass she merchant thousands of years later. Note the decorative fichu around her neck, the curved arms that look as though they could tackle anything. Then take another look at Margaret. Okay, you see a similarity? I do. Okay, back to the future. The suffrage movement of the early 19th century began in New York State. That is not an accident. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 was the first gathering to insist upon America's equal rights. And it owed a lot to that earlier groundwork laid by the Dutch. The National American Woman Suffrage Association dated to 1890. So she merchants paved the way for the people who fought for our inalienable right to vote. And I love the expressions on these women's faces. Talk about boss. They're so amazing. So Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were not blood descendants of Margaret, Catherine, Joanna, Mary, but they might as well have been. They certainly inherited their spunk and their drive. Susan B. Anthony, okay, she was so great. Of course, she was an architect of the suffrage movement. And in this photograph, we see her on her 50th birthday. Once again, check out that take no guff look. She even went to jail for attempting to cast a vote in the national election. So to my mind, that sounds like the kind of stunt that Margaret would have tried to pull. And of course, this is a letter over her signature, and enough said, equal rights for all, women included, is the basic principle of our republic. 1900, I mean, look back to the women that we were talking about, and it had been a long time. Sojourner Truth. Now, she came from a completely different heritage. She was born into slavery, but get this, in upstate New York. She actually was raised speaking Dutch as her first language. Um, she escaped with her baby daughter, and I think we all know her words. And Ain't I a Woman? Uh, from the 1851 Women's Rights Convention. But I'm going to tell you a little bit more from that speech. I'm going to read it. I have as much muscle as any man and can do as much work as any man. I have plowed and reaped and husked and chopped and mowed, and can any man do more than that? I can carry as much as any man and can eat as much too, if I can get it. I am as strong as any man now. Um, don't you think her words could have served as pretty much a manifesto of a certain woman in New Amsterdam? And I want you to know her boss expression. And remember, she was born and raised in New York State. Here is her signature, because I think a woman's signature is so important, and especially for somebody for whom literacy was actually not even allowed at that time. Okay, Dr. Mary Walker, another New Yorker. She was born upstate, and she became the first recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor in 1865. She worked as a surgeon for the North during the Civil War, and she was an outspoken advocate for women's rights. By the way, something I like about her, she was constantly getting in trouble for wearing men's clothes. So, a fundamental badass. So, thank you, Dr. Walker. Now, on to turn of the century New York. Here is a modern Venus figure, the a sculpture of the Republic at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. Um, at the time, it was the biggest um, statue ever made. The image went viral. This is a department store in New York City at that time, and people used to say, "Meet me at the fountain." The model was somebody named Edith Minturn. So she was a New York debutante. This doesn't look a lot like that amazing statue, but again, check out her expression and try to remember that take no guff expression of the original shoe merchant. Her grandfather, Robert Mount Minturn, bought a 173-acre estate in Hastings, where I live, in 1857. It was called Locust Wood, and it was in what is now Zimmer Park. She lived there as a teenager, and at that time, the Minturn girls, she and her sisters, were considered so beautiful. The color of their eyes was actually termed Minturn blue. So they were famous, but she became famous for something else too, a portrait of her and her husband by John Singer Sargent. Now, she was widely critiqued as the model of what was called the New Woman. Okay. And it was thought that her clothing exemplified that, and also her posture, those the hands on her hips, that expression on her face. And I mean, it was thought that the world had gone mad. However, I want you to note this, okay? Any resemblance, look at the posture. Okay. The thing about Edith, it looks as though she could have rode in on a bicycle, okay? And this was more outrageous than we can imagine now. Our friend Susan B. Anthony, her comment about bicycles was, and I'm going to read it to you. I think the bicycle has done more to emancipate women than any one thing in the world. So Edith went on to do something equally important. This was her social set, okay? Instead of the haves, though, she decided to focus on the have-nots. At that time, 75% of New Yorkers lived in tenements. So she ran an organization with the purpose of educating immigrant children. Um, she dedicated herself to helping the poor. So I think that is work worthy of a she merchant or a woman's rights advocate or even a goddess. On to our final boss lady. Madam C.J. Walker. She began by selling hair care products door to door in 1906. She wound up creating a gigantic cosmetics company and becoming the first female self-made millionaire in America. Well, she didn't bother with bicycles. She had this rather flashy car. By 1917, the company had trained nearly 20,000 women as sales agents. Madam C.J. Walker moved to Irvington, and you all know her house on Broadway. Walker very much wanted her villa to be a gathering place for both community leaders and to inspire other African Americans to follow their dreams. And you can see her here. I know I don't have to tell you about the expression on her face. You can see it is definitely boss. Because I think that a woman's signature is worth a lot. I want to share this signature Barbie with you. I think we'd all like to see a Barbie based on Margaret or Mary or Catherine or Dr. Walker or any of those people. So, just out of curiosity, I Googled strong women to prepare for this talk. And this is what I came up with. Of course, Wonder Woman, but notice the expression on her face, okay? Of course, one of our great athletes, again, boss expression, Michelle Obama. Now, I want you to remember that in so many photographs we have of Michelle, she's smiling and laughing. But in this official sanctioned photo by her of her, what do you think we see? Okay, look at the expression on her face and tell me if it doesn't seem to you to be more reminiscent of a she merchant like Margaret Hardenbrook. Okay. So, in conclusion, I think we all contain a little bit of a boss lady in us, even a bit of a goddess. So I came up with some good advice for our daughters, which is be like Margaret, not only for Women's History Month, but for every month. Thank you for your interest. If you want to email me, you can. And that's about it. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jean. I really appreciate it. Very, very interesting to travel through history with you and to see all the amazing images and information you're able to share. And so we'll move right into a Q&A period. A number of people asked questions, and we'll get right into a good technical legal one about marriage. Why would Dutch women have opted for manus marriage versus a usus one, where she had more power and rights? What was the dynamic there?
Yeah, that's a great question. From my understanding, there would be situations when, say, a woman came from a less privileged background than her husband, it might be worthwhile for her to um, place herself under his legal care in that way. It's hard for us to imagine now. I know.
Okay. And then, do you think that street traders as importers had impact on what products were brought in, or were they indistinguishable from other male traders?
Yeah, I think that somebody who was a female trader, like Margaret, definitely had her finger on the pulse of what women in the New World would have wanted for their household. So things like linen that was useful for something as everyday as what they called nose cloth. nose cloth. Sorry, a nose cloth was a handkerchief. And so, even something as mundane as that, or any of the things I listed before, whether bodices or toys, I don't. I mean, a man who was trading with Europe, I think he might have thought of those things, but it was something that was definitely germane for a woman who had a household. And by the way, of course, Margaret had children, and she actually had five children. So.
Okay. There was a question related to when Frederick and Margaret married, who was richer? I don't know if that's something
He was.
he was, yes. And then
No, he was. Margaret was.
Margaret was. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Uh, Someone asked, Gene, the difference between women's rights under the Dutch versus the English is not common knowledge. What do you think why do you think it's important, the difference?
Um, hmm.
Or why might it matter to know the difference between the rights of women under Dutch versus English rule?
It's important. I think it's important to understand our history and that, it hasn't been that long ago that we, for instance, won the right to vote. 100 years, that's nothing. And I think it's so easy to forget that that was not always a part of the construct. And, memory is so important.
Uh, Someone who's interested in your books asks if the theme of the she merchant appears in any of your other books.
Sure. Well, specifically, somebody I spoke about in this talk, Edith Minturn, is the focus, along with her husband, of my book, Love Fiercely, A Gilded Age Romance. And that's a biography of the two.
Excellent. All right, I think, let me just scan here that we heard from everybody who asked a question. Um, so with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to share the work that you have done in such a engrossing, interesting fashion. I'm going to ask Veronica to join us as well. Veronica Gedrich, who's the president of the Irvington Historical Society Board, and really appreciate you taking your time today. So thank you, Jean.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity.
I'm going to stop the sharing slide, and Veronica, if you're available.
Yes. Can you all see me? I hope so. Jean, I wanted to say what a fun and wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing it with us today. And everyone in our audience, thank you for joining us. I'm Veronica Gedrich, president of the Irvington Historical Society, and I'd like to give you a brief heads up on our next exciting program, so don't log off yet. On April 27th at 2 p.m., we will host a program by Deborah Bruno, author of A Hudson Valley Reckoning. It's the story of her family's slave ownership in the area of Coxsackie, New York. While most people think of slave ownership as a practice more prevalent in the South, Deborah explains that it was quite common in the North and had characteristics that derived from the economy and the customs of European families who owned land here. In researching her own family history, she discovered a descendant of the enslaved people that her family actually owned and ended up partnering with her to delve into the family history. We're very excited that this descendant, Eleanor Meyer, will also appear at the program to help tell this story to us. Please join us then on April 27th at 2 p.m. at the Main Street School. And this will be a live event with a book signing, and there will be no need to register in advance. This event, by the way, was scheduled for earlier in the year, but had to be postponed and rescheduled because of bad weather. In addition, we're excited to announce the new exhibit of our hometown newspaper, the Irvington Gazette, which is no longer being published, but which exists in our archives and is available in digital form. Learn about the history of the paper, the events it covers, and how newspapers were printed back in the day. Check out our new monitor at the McVicker House, which will play a documentary short for exhibit visitors. Again, this exhibit will be at the McVicker House at 131 Main Street and will be open Thursdays and Saturdays, 1 to 4 p.m., starting sometime in April. So check your website for the opening date. Before I sign off, I'd like to remind you that all of our programs and projects are dependent on public support. If you enjoyed today's program and want to help us produce more of them, please make a donation. Go to irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org and scroll down to the donate button. Thank you in advance for your support and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Veronica. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.